You know the Australian housing market is totally screwed when more and more people from overseas keep talking about it. In fact, the Australian housing crisis is getting global attention because it's one of the worst in the entire world. So how has Australia destroyed its housing market so badly that it's now getting globally shamed for it? Over the past few months, we've witnessed an increase in global attention for the Australian housing market. First, there was this Bloomberg YouTube video titled "Why Australia's Housing Crisis is a Warning for the World," and that's now been viewed over 1 million times. We've got global channels like Wall Street Silver who are sharing footage of the increase in tent cities, which is happening across parks all over Australia. And most recently, we've got this YouTube video from Andrei Jikh, which is a warning about the Australian housing crisis and has been viewed about 250,000 times. So today I'm going to focus on Andrei's video and provide my commentary. Let's check it out.
Alright, so we have to talk about beautiful Australia, where everything is trying to ruin your life. Box jellyfish, swole kangaroos that look fresh out of prison, venomous snakes, terrifying spiders, and the scariest of all of these, Australian real estate.
So many people from overseas think that Australia just has all these venomous and dangerous animals that could kill you at any time. But the reality is, Australian real estate is much more scary, because if you're on the wrong side of it, as in you don't own any, then it will eat you up and spit you out.
The median home price in Australia's 8 capital cities is now approaching almost $1 million.
House prices in most Australian capital cities is now absolutely absurd. And we're not talking ultra glamorous houses for $1 million. In many places, we're talking just a standard 3-bedroom house on a medium-sized block.
In the last couple of decades, home prices in Australia have quadrupled while incomes have only doubled.
To say house prices have eclipsed income since the late 1990s would be a complete understatement. House prices have basically skyrocketed while the average full-time earnings have basically grown at a snail's pace. If you look at the 70s, 80s and most of the 90s, full-time earnings were growing slowly, but so were house prices. And because of this, housing remained extremely affordable for nearly 25 years.
Let me just show you something called the price-to-income ratio. Now, a healthy, normal, good price-to-income ratio is supposed to be between 3 to 5 times someone's yearly income.
3 to 5 times the average yearly income? That means if I was earning 80 grand a year, which I think is fairly average, then affordable housing would sit between 240,000 and 400,000. That just seems like a fantasy with unicorns who fart glitter bombs.
In the United States, the median price-to-income ratio is a little over 4.
The US shares a border with Canada, and the crazy thing is that the Canadian houses over the border are basically twice as expensive as the US houses on the other side. Same houses, same area, yet because of policies over a long period, the price of those houses are completely different.
Now, if you looked at a list of the top 10 most expensive price-to-income cities in the world, you'd find 3 Australian cities on that list. In 9th place, for example, is Melbourne, where a house is almost 10 times the median yearly income. And in 2nd place is Sydney at almost 13.5.
So this is from the Demographia Housing Affordability Report, which has been analysing housing affordability for many years now. So in this report, Australia has Brisbane, Adelaide, Melbourne and Sydney all in the top 17 worst affordable housing markets in the world, with Sydney being the 2nd worst behind Hong Kong. I mean, how can policymakers see that data and continue to do nothing tangible to try and improve housing affordability? When it comes to trying to keep housing affordability for all citizens, Australia's become a global embarrassment.
And thanks to interest rates going up, it's put a huge strain on renters and people with a mortgage.
Actually, thanks to COVID policies which hyper-stimulated the economy, Australia, like many other countries around the world, are facing a housing crisis.
If the market is in a bubble, and it shouldn't be going up as much as it is, why is it that the Australian housing market went up by 11.9% in 2023?
Well, house prices in Australia did initially fall quite sharply when interest rates first started rising, but then the government stepped in and flooded the country with record immigration levels, which once again created ridiculous demand for housing, sending prices prices surging again.
And the basic explanation for why it's happening is more or less the same around the world. We've had historically low interest rates for over a decade, which made it easier to borrow money, and it encouraged people to buy investment properties.
This is very true. Interest rates prior to COVID kept getting lowered and lowered year after year, even though the economy wasn't in any sort of crisis. In fact, in 2019, house prices looked set to decline, but interest rates ended up getting lowered to below 1% cash rate. So this was prior to COVID, and Australian interest rates were basically acting like the economy was falling apart. Is there anything Australia won't do to keep house prices rising?
And as people and investors bought more properties, there were less available on the market, and that was made especially worse after the 2020 pandemic when interest rates were dropped even more.
Interest rates weren't just dropped in Australia. The RBA actually forecast there would be no interest rate rises until 2024. And wouldn't you know it, since that forecast, we've had 13 interest rate rises. That's got to be one of the worst calls in the history of bad calls, and to put a speculative rocket under Australian house prices and basically created wild desperation for housing.
And now we're in this weird timeline of events where everyone is waiting for prices to come down, but instead they're going up.
One thing Andrei doesn't know is that Australian house prices never fall. I think when any new Australian government gets sworn in, they have to take an oath to say that Australian house prices will never fall more than 10%, and they'll get a lucrative bonus if house prices massively outperform wages. And wouldn't you know it, that's exactly what's happened over the past 25 years.
And if you live in Australia, you're probably familiar with at least two of these economic policies that people criticize are a big part of the reason why Australian real estate has become so unaffordable.
Don't mention capital gains tax discount or negative gearing, Andrei. Those are sacred cows for Australian investors, and we will defend them with our lives.
And number one, there's something called the capital gains tax discount. And this is a policy that says if you hold an investment, like an investment property, for more than 12 months, and you go to sell it for a profit, you only have to pay for half of the capital gains taxes. So for those in the highest tax bracket of 45%, they would only have to pay 22.5%. And some economists argue this is one of the biggest reasons why home prices went up as much as they did after its introduction.
This is why every Australian, if they have enough money, buys an investment property. And that's because you can loan the most when you buy property, way more than you can for shares. You're almost guaranteed to have extraordinary capital gains because the government and the central bank support ultra high house prices. And if you ever need to sell, you get a 50% discount on the capital gains tax you have to pay. So really, policies like the capital gains tax discount just encourage people to get into crazy debt to buy as many properties as they possibly can. Now normally, over leveraging into an asset is very risky, but not when it comes to Australian property.
Now here's another example of a policy that favors capital. It's called negative gearing, and here's how that works. If the cost of your investment property is more than the money that you make from it, you can use the difference to deduct from your taxable income. Now, critics of this policy say that this creates an unfair tax advantage for investors because a lot of these costs are not real, out-of-pocket, out-of-your-wallet kind of things. Instead, they are paper losses like depreciation, which they don't actually have to pay.
We have talked about negative gearing multiple times on this channel because it does greatly benefit investors and allows them to buy more properties than they would have without this deduction. But a great point that Andrei brings up is that part of the expenses claimed for negative gearing includes things like depreciation, which is not an actual cash expense to the investor. And the thing that's most valuable in Australia is the actual land. So a property investor can claim depreciation on the physical house, but because their land is so valuable, they're potentially able to claim depreciation in value that's not even occurring.
So that means that leaves them with more money in their wallet. And when you combine both of these policies, it incentivizes those with capital to take out a loan, to get a tax break on the loan, to rent out their property while they make an income, and while it goes up in value, once they're done and they want to sell, they'll only pay for half the taxes that they should.
That's the Australian housing market, Andrei, where it's much easier for an investor to buy their 6th or 7th property than it is for a renter to buy their first property just to live in. And even Prime Minister Albanese agrees.
We're in danger of developing a society whereby some people are able to buy their 6th, 7th, 8th home but people trying to get into the housing market to buy their first home simply aren't able to.
Oh, but that was actually before he was in government. Now he just wants his $6 million property portfolio to go up.
And one of the most heartbreaking parts about all of this is that it was actually a lot better in the past. It was amazing. 3 out of 4 people who lived in Australia in the 1960s actually owned a house. But fast forward to data from 2021, and only 40% are homeowners for people ages 25 to 34, and that number is all the way down to 28% for the lowest income in that age bracket. And nowadays, it takes the average person 12 years to save for a down payment.
And it's around 20 years if you live in Sydney. And while you're saving for those 20 years, house prices have again tripled in price. So basically, you'll never be able to afford a home, but property investors will be able to afford 10 of them. And the sad and very scary thing is that more and more people are going to retire without owning a single property. And that's really quite devastating because more and more people are going to be pushed towards poverty and potentially even made homeless.
Data shows that almost half of the retirees ages 65 and up that rent today live in poverty. So it's a very bad sign for any country that has an increased rate of renters and a decreased rate of homeowners.
It is a terrible sign, but because the majority of Australians own property and property has made ridiculous gains over the last few years, most Australians are salivating just looking at the crazy high house prices because it means their personal wealth is going through the roof. Andrei has done a great job pointing out how the Australian housing market is now a speculative play toy for the rich. And if we keep going down this path where house prices massively outperform wages, then we'll likely end up in a humanitarian crisis where non-homeowners are pushed further and further towards poverty. I'm Biko Konstantinos.